It was said, in the forgotten records of Harrowridge County, that no photograph of the Hollowpine family ever captured the true expression of the matriarch, the widow who lived in a lonely house on the eastern edge of the Ozark Highlands. In all the preserved images, her face remained too still, as if she had learned too early to hide any emotion that could be read. And it was precisely in one of these photographs, recovered years later, already faded by time, that the first clue to a mystery that would shape local history for decades would emerge. The case of the 33 loggers who disappeared in 1901 did not begin with the disappearance itself. It began with a woman. Eleanor Hollowpine, then 48 years old, had been a widow since the winter of 1894, when her husband, the logger Isaac Hollowpine, died buried by a rockfall during an unexpected storm. Since then, she had been managing the small property she inherited from him on her own. A tall, narrow house with an attic that seemed to have been built to store more shadows than objects. The Ozark Highlands region at the beginning of the century was a land of silence and distance. Villages separated by miles of forest, poorly marked dirt roads, and an unpredictable climate that changed without warning. There, life went on with an almost ritualistic rigidity. Men worked in logging, women took care of the house and children, and everyone knew each other by name, or by the nickname they had earned over the years. But in the case of the Hollowpines, few certainties existed. The family was seen as reserved, almost secretive. Before his death, Isaac was known for being overly strict with his employees. Eleanor, on the other hand, spoke little, although she greeted everyone with a politeness that never sounded entirely natural. Archives from the time show that the community had an ambiguous relationship with her. On the one hand, they respected her strength. Managing that isolated property required courage and skill, but on the other, there was an unease that was difficult to name. Some said the house was too big for one person. Others commented that it was strange how she never considered selling it or moving closer to her relatives in Tennessee. And then there was the attic. Always the attic. According to later reports, the triangular window on the top floor would open on windy nights, banging like a signal that no one wanted to interpret. However, there were no formal accusations, no serious incidents, no recorded stories that suggested anything beyond the eccentricity of a woman who had learned to survive on her own. Everything changed in the fall of 1901, when 33 lumberjacks hired to cut trees in the region disappeared in just 13 weeks, always in the vicinity of the Hollowpine property. At first, the cases were seen as isolated accidents. After all, the Ozark woods were treacherous. There were hidden cliffs, narrow caves, and wild animals that often left few traces. But when the records were reviewed decades later, a silent pattern emerged. Most of the missing men had somehow passed through the widow's house, some to ask for water, others for small commercial exchanges, such as flour or kerosene, and some, according to fragmented testimonies, were invited in to take a break from the cold. None of this, individually, was incriminating. What intrigued researchers was something else, an almost invisible detail found on the back of one of the county's official photographs, dated August 1901. The image showed Eleanor in front of the house, her expression neutral as always. But on the back, a county official had written, "Attic locked again. She says it's because of the wind. Doesn't look like it." This simple, almost disinterested sentence would become, for later historians, the first loose thread in a case that, over the decades, would be considered one of the strangest series of disappearances in the region. And when the county finally gathered all the remaining clues, a more disturbing pattern emerged. All reports of the woodcutter's last appearance pointed to a specific stretch of road, a steep curve a few meters from the Hollowpines' house. There, according to the documents, the sound of the wind took on an unusual, almost metallic tone, as if something were deflecting it. The logbook ends abruptly. Between the pages, a note-taker from that time wrote only, "There is something in the attic that no one can explain." And that is precisely where the mystery begins. To understand the disappearance of the 33 woodcutters, one must first carefully and patiently reconstruct the daily life of the region at the end of that century. The archives show that life in the Ozark Highlands was marked by a harsh simplicity. Isolated houses, damp mornings, freshly cut wood stacked in front of porches, and men who left before dawn to face dense forests, where the smell of resin and wet earth seemed to never disappear. The Hollowpine property was strategically located between two paths, the main road leading to the village of Briarford and a narrow secondary trail used by experienced woodcutters to cut through to the logging areas. This trail passed less than 40 meters from Eleanor's house, making it a natural stop for anyone in need of water, temporary shelter, or just guidance. There was something inevitable about that location. Sooner or later, everyone crossed paths with the widow. Documents from 1898 describe Eleanor as a methodical woman, almost to the point of rigidity. She always woke up before sunrise, lit the wood stove, organized utensils with precision, and single-handedly tended to the vegetable garden, which, despite the difficult soil, seemed to flourish more vigorously than her neighbors. Those who passed by the property said she had a way of speaking that did not match the monotony of the region. Articulate, unhurried, as if she was someone who rarely spoke useless words. One of the few preserved testimonials, given by a young woman who worked in the house for only a few weeks in 1899, describes Eleanor as kind but reserved, always looking over her shoulder, as if checking who might be listening. The widow's behavior became even more reserved after her husband's death. According to records from the local vicar, she refused to leave the house even during the harshest months of winter. Some attributed this to obstinacy, others to fear of losing what little remained of her former life. Regardless of the reason, the fact is that Hollowpine House, as it came to be called, remained almost untouched, a dark wooden structure with narrow windows and an attic that seemed too large for the needs of a woman alone. The community's routine continued as usual. At the end of the summer of 1900, groups of lumberjacks from different counties began to migrate to the Ozark region, attracted by quick logging contracts. The presence of these temporary men was common. They stayed for a few months, received their pay, and moved on to the next job. Few left lasting traces. That's why it took so long to realize that some of them simply weren't coming back. The first signs that something was wrong emerged almost imperceptibly. A lumberjack from Arkansas, registered as Amos Tilton, was supposed to have boarded the train back to Missouri in October 1901. He never showed up at the station. At the time, it was assumed that he had found work in another county. With no family nearby, no one insisted. The same happened with William Crossford, last seen at a small warehouse near the Hollowpine Trail. His absence was treated as voluntary abandonment, a common practice among itinerant workers. But small details began to accumulate as the weeks passed. In a letter dated September 1901, found years later among loose papers at the county courthouse, a local merchant wrote that several boys are walking around discouraged, saying that the trail is different, too quiet, too heavy. The letter does not mention Eleanor. It only mentions the stretch of road. However, a stamp indicates that it was found among documents related to the Hollowpine property. Another clue came from the diary of a young logging assistant who wrote, "I heard that some men slept at the widow's house. She seems lonely, but I don't feel confident. Something in her eyes, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't." The diary ends abruptly a few days later. The young man left Ozark, but was never located for further questioning. The community's relations with Eleanor were cordial but distant. Older women avoided visiting her alone. Men passed by quickly, without prolonging conversations. Children, in the rare accounts that appear, spoke of a smell of damp wood coming from the attic, as if something had been stored there for too long. Of course, childhood memories have no solid documentary value, but they demonstrate how the house exerted a certain silent discomfort on the neighborhood. As the year 1901 progressed, small episodes were recorded in a fragmented way. A worker who said he heard footsteps in the attic when he visited the widow. Another who said he saw dim lights in the triangular window at times when the house should have been dark. A third who claimed to have been invited upstairs to help with something heavy, but who refused without knowing how to explain why. None of these reports would be enough to raise suspicion on their own. However, when analyzed together, decades later, they created an unsettling backdrop that preceded the disappearances. And it was precisely during this period, between August and November 1901, that the trail near the house began to be viewed with some hesitation. There was no concrete danger, just that vague feeling that something was out of rhythm, as if the forest breathed differently in that part of the path. The last sign of normality appears in a commercial record. Eleanor bought more kerosene than usual. When questioned, she said that the winter promised to be harsh, nothing more than that. And it was precisely at this point, when everyone believed that the season would be like any other, that the pattern of disappearances would become impossible to ignore. The block ends with a comment made by the county sheriff on a note attached to one of the records. "I can't explain it, but all roads seem to lead to the widow's house." And from here, the story really starts to darken. The last days leading up to the collective disappearance of the woodcutters are among the most difficult to reconstruct, as almost all the information comes from belated reports, side notes, and fragments of testimonies collected years later. Still, when placed side by side, they form an unsettling mosaic, a collection of small gestures, noises, and encounters that, in retrospect, seem to point in the same direction: the Hollowpine house. The first accurately recorded occurrence took place on October 14, 1901. That morning, 3 lumberjacks, Garrett Nolan, Thomas Huxley, and Elijah Grant, were seen crossing the narrow trail that bordered the widow's property. According to a resident's account, they looked tired and were discussing something in low voices. The tallest of them, Huxley, reportedly commented that the previous night had been stranger than usual. He did not explain why. He just looked in the direction of the house, whose triangular attic window was open, letting a thin curtain sway in the breeze. This would be the last confirmed record of Nolan and Huxley. Grant would be seen one more time, but he would not speak to anyone. In the days that followed, the weather in the region changed suddenly. Stronger winds blew from the hills, and the forest took on a damp, almost metallic smell. Some workers reported hearing unusual crackling sounds during the night, coming from an undefined point among the trees. Others said that the trail was darker, even in the afternoon. These subjective perceptions will have no value for the official investigation, but they reappear in almost all the testimonies collected in the 1920s. The penultimate week of October was marked by frequent comings and goings of small groups of woodcutters who were trying to take advantage of the rest of the season before winter. It was common for them to walk long distances, carrying tools and seeking makeshift shelter on small properties. Hollowpine House, with its good reputation as a source of drinking water, was an occasional stop. Eleanor, according to several records, always offered water and a quick rest. This caused many exhausted men to approach her during the critical period of the disappearances. One of the most significant accounts is that of a lumberjack named Paul Redding, one of the rare survivors of that wave. In a statement given almost 40 years later, he described his last encounter with Eleanor. She was different that afternoon, quieter than usual. She didn't look up when I asked for water. She just pointed to the bucket and stood there, her hand resting on the counter as if she were listening to something else. A distant sound, perhaps. I don't know. But when I left, I had the impression that she was watching me from the attic window. I'm not sure. I've never been sure. This testimony, although belated, became one of the most cited by historians, as it coincides with what other residents would report years later. The feeling that the house seemed occupied by more than just the widow herself. The last confirmed disappearance, which closes the group of 33, occurred on November 3, 1901. The reconstruction of that day, based on official documents, indirect statements, and a letter that was only found in 1936, is the most detailed and also the most distressing part of the case. On the morning of that day, 5 woodcutters, including young Elijah Grant, who had survived the initial episode, were seen walking north, where the densest logging area was located. The group took tools, 2 days' worth of supplies, and flashlights. None of them returned. But what is striking is that the last visual record of them was not in the woods, but at the bend in the road in front of the Hollowpine house. According to a letter found decades later, written by a teacher named Miriam Ellsworth, she saw the men stop in front of the house, not because they needed water or shelter, but because they heard a noise coming from the attic, a slow, heavy, dragging sound, like something being moved. The teacher describes how the men looked at each other, hesitated, and then one of them knocked on the gate calling for Eleanor. This excerpt from the letter has never been corroborated, but it fits with uncanny precision with the other traces. A second account, collected in 1919 by a Missouri journalist, states that a distant farmer saw lights in the attic window that same night. Lights that moved, like shadows passing before the flame of a lantern. The farmer did not investigate. No one would investigate that night. From that point on, the disappearance takes its final form. The men were never seen again, and no tools, clothing, or signs of a struggle were found in the woods. The section of the trail remained intact, with compacted earth and no signs of dragging. The silence that enveloped the region in the following days was described as thick, suffocating, although the phrase appears only in later literary accounts, never in official ones. What is known for certain is that 2 days after the collective disappearance, Eleanor was seen on the porch of her own home, folding sheets with extreme precision. A neighbor, interviewed years later, stated that the widow seemed calm, even too calm. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she knew nothing. But her eyes, there was something off about them, as if she were tired of keeping a secret. The most disturbing point, however, comes from a document that was almost ignored for decades, an inventory report made by the police chief about the interior of the house. In it, there is a single observation about the attic. Door reinforced from the inside, locked. Owner says it is to keep animals out. Does not seem necessary. This sentence directly echoes the note found on the back of the photograph in Block 1, creating a temporal and symbolic link between the two main pieces of the mystery. The historiographical climax of the case, the one that most intrigues researchers to this day, appears only at the end of the report. In the last line, there is an isolated comment, almost lost amid stamps and erasures. There are recent marks on the attic floor, marks of something heavy being dragged, origin unidentified. Next to this note, a quick sketch, probably made by one of the assistants, shows something even more disturbing. An arrow pointing to the triangular window in the attic, the very one where so many said they saw lights and shadows. It is this detail, silent and almost forgotten, that closes the documentary block. The last known evidence points directly to the Hollowpine attic. And from that window, that triangular opening to nowhere, the whole mystery leans, as if the entire story were about to collapse on that specific point of the house. In the days following the disappearance of the last 5 woodcutters, the region entered a state of unrest that few documents can fully convey. The residents of the Ozark Highlands had always been accustomed to silence, to risk, to the long distances between one house and another, but not to the absolute void left by the absence of so many men in such a short time. The truth is that only when the county added up the names and realized there were 33 did the scale of the problem finally become apparent to everyone. The local sheriff, a methodical man named Samuel Conroy, was the first to declare that this was no coincidence. In his initial report, he wrote, "There is no record of accident, illness, or animal attack that would account for the sum. There is something out of place in the natural order of things." But despite this observation, Conroy had no concrete clues, only gaps. It was only after 3 days of fruitless searching in the woods that investigators returned to Hollowpine House. Not out of direct suspicion, but by process of elimination. All of the missing persons had in some way passed by the bend in the road in front of the house. Some had drunk water there. Others, according to later reports, had been seen talking to Eleanor on the porch. And 1 or 2, according to old rumors, had even asked for shelter inside the house during storms. The community, which had always treated Eleanor with respectful reserve, began to grow uneasy. Women whispered in the markets. The men avoided walking alone on the trail. The few young people in the area began to take long detours to avoid the bend. The tension, silently, already pointed to the widow even before any authority did. When Conroy finally knocked on the door of Hollowpine House for a formal inspection, Eleanor greeted him with the posture of someone who already knew the reason for the visit. She did not protest, show indignation, or surprise. She simply opened the door and walked ahead of him, guiding him through the rooms with restrained movements. This coldness was noted in the official report. The owner cooperates without resistance, but shows an unusual lack of emotion. The search of the house revealed nothing significant, until the deputy asked to see the attic. There, according to most records, the most tense moment of the entire investigation occurred. Eleanor hesitated. It was the only hesitation described in the entire process. She did not argue. She did not make excuses. She just stopped, took a breath, and stared at the narrow staircase leading to the top floor. The attic was locked from the inside. The door showed signs of recent reinforcement. When it was finally opened by Conroy himself, it revealed a large, old space, full of accumulated dust, with empty boxes and old furniture piled up. At first glance, nothing there indicated a crime. But there were details that were disturbing. The floor showed traces of heavy dragging, as in the report mentioned in the previous block. The triangular window let in a cold wind that seemed to blow through the entire room. And in the right corner, on the worn wood, there was a small, dark stain that no one could immediately identify. Years later, this stain would be described as the most human piece of the mystery. It was not blood. The rudimentary tests of the time did not indicate this, nor was it paint, oil, or charcoal. Some speculated that it was old wood resin, others that it could be organic material deteriorated by time. Nothing conclusive. But this stain, sitting there in the corner like a silent witness, would be mentioned in dozens of articles and interviews throughout the century. More striking than the stain was the discovery of an object that did not seem to belong in the house, a piece of rough fabric, stuck under a slightly loose board. Conroy carefully removed it and realized it was part of a lumberjack's shirt, the kind worn by men in the region. The sheriff noted that Eleanor remained motionless while he examined the fabric, just watching him with a distant expression. It was this moment that definitely sparked suspicion, but the suspicions never became evidence. Exhaustive searches were conducted in the surrounding woods, digging up entire valleys, checking ravines, combing through narrow caves and swampy areas. Sniffer dogs were brought in from the neighboring county, but they found no traces. Nothing. No objects, no tool remnants, no signs of a struggle or escape. All 33 men seemed to have been erased from the territory, as if they had left the road and walked straight into the void. In this atmosphere of community despair, testimonies began to emerge, and with them contradictions. An old lumberjack claimed to have heard muffled screams one night coming from the direction of Hollowpine House. A woman swore she had seen 2 men on the porch of the house arguing with Eleanor weeks before the disappearance. A group of young people said they had seen shadows passing through the triangular attic window at odd hours. None of the reports were verifiable, but they all carried the same kind of unease, that feeling that the house held something no one could name. Still, even with dozens of rumors, the county never found a direct link between Eleanor and the men's disappearance. No crime, no evidence, no reliable witnesses. The most they could come up with were small coincidences, like the location of the house, the marks in the attic, and the fabric found. Nothing concrete. The decisive moment, which would mark the collective memory of the region, came 6 days after the inspection. Conroy returned to the house for further questions, but found the widow sitting at the kitchen table, organizing old documents. She didn't wait to be questioned. She just said, in a voice that was too calm, "If I could help, I would, but I don't know what you're looking for." This phrase would echo for decades in reports, newspapers, and interviews. The most important and most human revelation did not come from Eleanor, but from secondary records. A neighbor, interviewed in 1910, said that the widow had spent entire nights sitting in the attic since her husband's death. She did not cook properly, did not sleep well, did not receive visitors. This behavior of deep isolation may explain her coldness during the investigations. Hollowpine House for her was not just a house, it was the last fragment of her past life. A place where she kept the pain she could never name. This is the revelation that more recent historians tend to consider central. Eleanor Hollowpine was not hiding a crime. She was hiding a grief that was never resolved. The attic, with its marks, reinforcements, and silence, may have been just the space where she tried to keep her husband's presence alive in some way. Reorganized objects, dragged boxes, moved furniture. The human mind fills voids with rituals. Still, no human explanation seems sufficient in the face of the sum of the missing. And that is the most bitter nature of historical accounts. There are cases where the truth exists, but can never be reached. The file block ends with 2 sentences from Deputy Conroy, handwritten at the end of the last report. I find no evidence. I find no men. I find no answers. And just below, but everything always comes back to the attic. Today, more than a century later, when the name Hollowpine is mentioned in meetings of local historians or in small publications from forgotten counties, what remains is not the search for the 33 men, but the feeling that there is something deeply human hidden between the pages of this case, something that never fit into the reports, Sheriff Conroy's inventories, or the small newspaper clippings that survived the passage of time. Contemporary researchers, upon revisiting the archives, know immediately that they will not find objective answers. The documentation is too fragmented, the accounts too late, the impressions too subjective. Still, something in the case insists on surviving, not as a criminal mystery, but as a kind of open historical wound, a silence that refuses to disappear. Hollowpine House no longer exists. It was destroyed by a storm in 1932, and the debris was scattered across the hill like the shells of an ancient memory. Only the stone foundation remained, covered with moss and weeds. Some older residents say that when they walk there, they can imagine where the porch was, where the kitchen door opened, and where the narrow staircase led up to the attic. But nothing physical has survived clearly. It is the kind of ruin that belongs more to the imagination than to the land. What is most vividly preserved are the testimonies that never made it into official reports, stray phrases, vague memories, emotional impressions that have been passed down through generations. A woman from Briarford, interviewed in the 1950s, said that as a girl her mother made her avoid the bend in the road, not out of fear of Eleanor, but out of respect. That word, respect, appears with surprising frequency in the oldest accounts. It suggests that the community, despite its suspicions, never saw the widow as a direct threat, but rather as someone carrying an invisible burden. On academic visits to the site, observing the silent hill where the house once stood, historians often note the same phenomenon. A thick silence, different from the usual silence of the Ozark Mountains. It is a stillness that seems to carry something suspended in the air, not a secret, but an absence. As if that small piece of land still held the layers of stories that had overlapped there. Eleanor's grief, the footsteps of the woodcutters, the days lost in searches, the incomplete reports, the lingering doubts. When analyzing the documents, the strongest impression is that the men's disappearance may not be directly related to the house, and at the same time that nothing in that case seems to exist without it. It is as if Hollowpine House had functioned as an axis, a fixed point around which unstable, itinerant, lonely lives revolved. Men who passed quickly, leaving little record of their passage. A woman who stayed there too long, carrying more silence than she could bear. Perhaps that is why so many researchers find the case so disturbing, because it delivers no culprits. No clear crimes, no explanations that can be summed up in a single sentence. What remains in the end is only a set of subjectivities, impressions, gestures, hesitations, glances. And in the midst of all this, the figure of Eleanor Hollowpine, a woman marked by the loss of her husband and emotional isolation, trying to organize her own life inside a house that would become a symbol of something she could never control. One of the last documents found about her is a medical note, simple, dry language, which states, "Patient shows signs of prolonged grief, marked isolation, and fixed attachment to residence." This fragment, as banal as it is revealing, offers perhaps the most human interpretation of the entire case. Eleanor did not hide answers. She hid herself. And it is possible that over the years, many looked at the attic searching for traces of the woodcutters, when perhaps what existed there were only traces of a woman trying to preserve what little remained of her emotional stability. The last official mention of the case appears in a 1924 report written by a young researcher who visited the region. He concludes the text with a sentence that would become widely quoted by later scholars. "Some mysteries persist not because they are indecipherable, but because they belong more to the human heart than to logic." And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story so enduring. It is not about disappearances, it is about the void they leave behind. It is not about suspicion, it is about the silent weight that time places on people who never learn to ask for help. It is not about a house, it is about what grief does to those left behind. In concluding the analysis of this case, all that remains is the image that many researchers describe at the end of their visits to the site where Hollowpine House once stood. A light wind blowing across the hill, moving small dry leaves over the ancient stone that marked the base of the building. Nothing extraordinary, just the natural movement of things. But in that setting, that wind seems to carry more than air. It seems to carry memory. And if there is one thing that remains, more than any document, it is the feeling that the attic, that locked, reinforced space, marked by weight and silence, never held any answers. It held only the last form of resistance of a woman who lost her world and decided not to let it go entirely. The historian then closes his record with the phrase that has become almost an involuntary epitaph for the Hollowpine case. There are silences that do not ask for a solution. They only ask for someone to listen to them.